Welcome everybody in the ScruTone podcast of the Scruton Cafe. Our guest today is Nigel Biggar, an Anglican scholar from England, who wrote his last book on colonialism, and his approach is a little bit different than the approach of our time. It's a topic, and that's why he called this a big outrage. But he also have some other interesting books. For example, In Defense of War. I guess this is partly why you are here at the MCC Peace Summit. Or how should we behave in the public as Christians? It's another book. This is not the exact title, but that's what is it about. So maybe the first question could be not regarding your colonialist book, although we will go for that one, yep. But the Peace Summit. And you have this book, In Defense of War,
yes.
Which is also a little bit confusing for our times, even for Christians who tend to be more pacifist today than before. And you take accounts of the Iraq War, Kosovo, and other recent conflicts in this book. So what is your stance toward war in general? I mean, just war theory and other Christian Christian theories, and particularly to the Ukrainian-Russian war today.
Yes. So I gave my book on the ethics of war a provocative title, In Defense of War, because I was reacting against the tendency, particularly in Christian circles, toward pacifism. I mean, many Christians will say, well, now, I agree in theory that war might be justified, but in practice there's never a war that actually is worth fighting. So I was reacting against that, and I wanted to present the 1600-year-old Christian tradition of thinking about just war. So ever since St. Augustine in the early 400s, mainstream Christian churches, Roman Catholic and Protestant, not so much Orthodox, but the Western churches have endorsed the idea that sometimes going to war can be justified, although war does cause terrible damage. And so you don't want to go to war unless you really have to. But sometimes you really have to, and so that's what the book was arguing.
And would you tell us some concrete goals that you reached? I mean, which are the cases when you have to go to war, for example? If you give us an example.
So I tend to be hawkish. So with regard to Kosovo in 1999, my view is that the intervention by NATO was morally right, even though in terms of international law it was doubtful. But even there's a famous international lawyer and scholar of international law from Finland called Martti Koskaniemi, and even he can be. He at one point said that most lawyers regard the Kosovo intervention as unlawful but moral. And I'm not a lawyer, I'm an ethicist. And I agree. I think international law is important because it's important that tensions and conflicts between states be controlled. And if states sign up to international law and if they are bound by it, then the conflicts between them are limited under the law. But there are the law can't anticipate every case. And in the case of Kosovo, Albanians, Kosovar Muslims were being subject to ethnic cleansing by Serbian troops, Serbian police, and that was creating unrest in Macedonia, so there was regional disturbance developing. But of course Russia would have vetoed any intervention to stop this. And according to international law, it requires Security Council authorization to legitimate intervention. Nevertheless, Britain in particular then encouraged the United States, and I think about 40 other countries backed intervention in order to prevent a humanitarian crisis and also to prevent regional destabilization. So yes, it was illegal, but I would say it was moral.
So you detach moral arguments from the actual international law or the actual laws if they are not fit the ethics.
Yeah, I mean, let me be clear. I think one should never break international law lightly, but there can be grave circumstances where a good moral argument, and indeed you can find parts of law that will support the argument, where that can justify transgressing the letter of international law. And as I say, Koskiniemi himself said most lawyers think it was unlawful but moral. So even lawyers can recognize that.
I am familiar with the Catholic teaching, and the Catholic teaching, although traditionally is a just war theory, but recent theology try to shy away from that one, given that the modern weaponry technology is more damageable than gives more damage than in traditional war, where it's face-to-face war was more common. Do you think it's justified or not?
Yeah, well, I don't agree with the direction of Pope Francis's thinking on this. So I imagine that most people listening to this podcast, so certainly in Britain, I imagine in Hungary, would regard the war against Nazi Germany as justified, because of the nature of the regime, the murderous nature of the regime, the genocide against the Jews and others, Slavs. But that war cost the lives of between 60 and 80 million people. It also, as you know, in Hungary, had the unfortunate circumstance of handing over half of Europe to Stalin.
Yeah.
Those weren't good, and yet we still think it was justified. So part of what I want to do is to encourage Christians, whether Pope Francis or others, to be realistic. That no, war is not not morally unambiguous. It causes great damage, and if you engage in war, there will be things that are done that should not be done. But that's the human condition. There are risks here, but there are also risks in not going to war.
Of course. And what is your stance regarding the Russian-Ukrainian war?
Well, again, I'm hawkish. I mean, I understand that Ukraine, before the invasion, the government was, I'm told, I don't know, but some say the government was corrupt, and certainly up until Crimea was seized, many Russian-speaking Ukrainians were sympathetic to Moscow, although I'm also told that since the invasion, most Russian-speaking Ukrainians are now Ukrainian, not pro-Russia. And I understand that of course the resistance of the Ukrainian government and people to the invasion is costing everybody a lot. I mean, in terms of cost of living crisis in Europe, in Hungary, in Britain, and in terms of refugees, and of course in Ukraine itself, lives are being lost. But this is the main point. I think it's really important that people like Vladimir Putin and regimes like Russia's, maybe like President Xi in China, understand that invading another state to seize territory or to remove a government is not acceptable. And so I think it's because you can look back at the last 10 or so years, and you can see, first of all, Russia invaded Georgia, was not opposed. Then Russia intervened in Syria, was not opposed. Then Russia took Crimea, was not opposed. I mean, economic sanctions, but it wasn't stopped. So one can see how Mr. Putin learnt that he was able to act aggressively repeatedly, and nothing stopped him. And so he was encouraged to do this. So the concern is, if he succeeds in Ukraine, will he then next test the Baltic states or Poland? And that's much more serious, because it then crosses a NATO border. So I think I don't know what the settlement will be, and I'm not committed myself to Kiev's recovery of all the territory of Ukraine. I'm agnostic on that, but I do think it's important that Russia learn this is not to be repeated. And in order to, it seems, unfortunately, for Russia to learn that, she needs to suffer defeat, whatever defeat means.
There is the realistic theory of geopolitics, like Mersheimer or others.
Yes.
And it's very popular today, and also at Hungary. And one of my main questions theoretically in those years that if the Christian ethics of war, even not the pacifist one, so your one, and the geopolitical realism or foreign policy realism can be reconciled. So if there are some common territories, what do you think on that? And I ask partly because those guys says that Putin said before he warned the NATO not to accept Ukraine, and the territories around Russia are somehow geopolitical. He's not just his; it's Russia's. How the Russian says it, it's near abroad.
Yes. So I describe myself as a Christian realist, but I'm not a realist in the sense that you mean. So, as I understand it, I've read John Mearsheimer only once, and his view is that the basic motive that moves states is fear. Now, I grant you, fear is a large human motive, but as a Christian, I have to say, well, it's not just fear that motivates human beings. Sometimes there's a concern for justice, and sometimes we will overcome fear for the sake of justice. So I think there's a variety of human motives, and a Christian is going to say that we should be motivated primarily by a concern for justice and to achieve what's good. But I'm realist in the sense that as a Christian, I understand myself and all other human beings to be creatures. We are limited in power, we're limited in knowledge, there's a lot we don't know, and we can't predict the future, and we act. We don't know what the effects will be. We hope there'll be something, we don't know. But we have to take risks. So, and what's more, we're also sinners, and our understanding is distorted by sin, by exaggerated desires or exaggerated fears. And so I expect that any human enterprise, however overall just, this includes the Allies' war against Hitler, will contain elements of wrong. So I still think the war against Hitler was justified. I think the carpet bombing of German cities wasn't. And in the invasion of Normandy, sometimes Allied troops killed German prisoners in cold blood. So bad things happened. One has to be realistic about it. That doesn't mean that the overall moral justification for the enterprise is undermined.
What is Christian realism?
Well,
there's more than you said.
Yes, I mean
regarding human nature.
The title comes from an American theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, who flourished in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and was a rare case of a Christian theologian who actually influenced American foreign policy. But again, it was a combination of, yes, Christian principle, but Christian principle has to be honest about realities and about the limits that political realities impose on the pursuit of principle. So I think you contrast Christian realism with Christian utopianism. And my worry is a lot of Christian thinking at the moment is utopian, and therefore it doesn't really deserve respect.
It's a very interesting question, but I guess we could move forward to your recent book, Colonialism, which caused a big rage. Although, yeah, thank you. Although it's as I understood, it's not the polar opposite of the recent use. So it's not.
It's not what?
If the recent use usually is that colonialism was all bad.
Yes.
You are not like everything was good. So it's not like the polar opposite.
No.
More like a cautious balance.
Yes. So first of all, we're talking here in Budapest, and my sense is the issue of colonialism is quite remote from Hungarian concerns. But just to explain, the issue of colonialism is currently very controversial in English-speaking countries, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but also America. Because in America right now there's a lot of controversy about race, which again I think is a bit remote from Hungary.
Critical race theory and other stuff.
Yeah. But the idea in America is, the claim is that this is the so-called 1619 project that argues that the very foundations of the United States is racist.
Yeah.
And what this does is to delegitimate the United States.
The whole, as a whole, yeah.
The whole thing. And at a time when I mean, whatever the sins and flaws of the US, or whatever the sins and flaws of Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, in terms of historical injustice, those countries, along with Western Europe, comprise the West, the liberal democratic West, and if you believe that it's good for the state to be limited by law, and for individuals to have freedom under the law from unlawful state interference, then you will want to support the West against, let's say, Putin's Russia or President Xi's China. So it's dangerous to call into question the legitimacy, the very legitimacy of the most powerful state in the Western United States, but also of important states like Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, at a time of illiberal threat externally. So this is why the issue matters. So my book is not saying that Britain's 350-year career as an imperial power, unlike the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Ottoman Empire, Britain's empire was entirely overseas. My argument is not that everything that happened was good. As I've said, as a Christian, I wouldn't expect that. But that, contrary to the left-wing critics of European and British colonialism, it was not simply a litany of racism and economic exploitation and cultural suppression and excessive violence. It contained all those things. It also contained the opposite. So the most prominent example is, yes, some British were involved in slave trading of Africans to the West Indies, 1650 to 1800, but for the subsequent 150 years from 1807 thereabouts, the British Empire was committed to abolishing slavery from Brazil, across Africa, India to Malaysia. So first of all slavery, but then anti-slavery. And it's the second half that the radical left-wing critics want to forget, and I want to remind them.
And what are the positive effects of, what were the positive effects of colonialism, if you have some concrete examples?
Well, so the first would be, using imperial power to suppress slavery and slave trading all over the world, from 1807 to 1960. Also, under the British Empire, even though the Americans separated from the empire in 1787, the British founded the United States, then Canada, Australia, New Zealand, among the most prosperous and liberal countries in the world. It also helped to found Israel. What's more, between, I mean, the British war against Hitler was an imperial war, so you had in North Africa against the Germans, you had not just British but Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, West Africans, Indians. My father fought in Italy in 1944, and just to the right of his unit in the Apennines north of Rome, there was an Indian division fighting. So the British Empire exhausted itself in fighting Nazism. So it created states, it created political stability, which is one reason why up until about 1930, the British invested more overseas than any other nation. So a lot of British capital went to develop economies around the world because colonial states were stable, and investors only invest in a stable environment, otherwise the risk is too high. So the stability of colonial government encouraged investment and economic development. The other frequent benefit of imperial rule is that an overarching imperial authority helped to contain and moderate inter-ethnic and inter-religious conflict. And empires often do that, so that I mean, of course, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire disappeared after the First World War, one result was that you end up with ethnic and linguistic minorities stranded in Romania, for example, or and that's one of the problems of the disintegration of empires. You end up with different people stranded in an alien environment.
How should we behave as Christians in the public square? And why I ask it, because in the last years at Hungary it's a constant question regarding that the government is at least culturally Christian, but many of them are real believers. But of course they are in the government for many years, and they are not perfect, and there are accusations of corruption, and that they are just fake Christians and other stuff. So maybe it's a too general question, but how should we behave as Christians in public square, or what you see as the main the main problems or dangers?
So I can't comment on Hungarian politics. I don't know it well enough. But in my country and in the United States and other liberal Western countries, the argument is often made that it is assumed that religion and Christianity is a threat, and that therefore it's also assumed that religious people have these bizarre superstitious ideas, and when we enter the public square, we should forget our religion and operate sensibly and rationally. And I think
because religion is a private matter, let's say.
Religion is private, but this is nonsense, because everyone in the public square has beliefs, and these beliefs depend on a certain view of the world, and Christians and atheists are no different in that respect. And I don't see why religious people should have to suppress their religious convictions, and why atheists and others should, as it were, control the public space. So my view is that everyone should enter the public space being frank about their fundamental convictions. But you know, when we're talking about foreign policy, if you're an atheist and I'm a Christian, my view is that our fundamental views of the world and our values will shape our views of foreign policy, but when we're in a room to discuss policy on Ukraine, the question of why I believe in God will not arise. This is not what we're talking about. But it seems to me that Christians ought to be able to talk about any policy matter and to give their reasons and to make their arguments in public, just like anyone else. But that doesn't mean they're going to bring God or the Bible or church dogma into the public discussion. Maybe if someone raises a question about why on earth do you believe in God in the corridor or over coffee, that's fine. But it seems to me that we ought to be free to speak our minds in public. Although, if we want to be persuasive in a plural society, then Christians need to think carefully about how they make their case.
Yeah, but certainly it's legitimate to make their case.
It is. In a liberal,
even religious beliefs.
In a properly liberal society, which is open to all views, properly religious, as a properly liberal, not a kind of secularist society, it should be possible for everyone to make their case in public.
So religion is not just a private matter?
No, absolutely not. Whenever I speak in public, I speak as a Christian, although I don't necessarily identify the deep roots of what I'm saying about Ukraine or what I'm saying about immigration. But if someone asks me to, I can. But then I'm a professional Christian ethicist, so I know how to do that.
And what about the when you can say that the government, the Hungarian government was just the case where I came up with the questions, but I do not want to make you to speak about the Hungarian government, just in general or with other examples that a government can do the case that they are a Christian government, or is it risky, or what is your?
Well, of course, everything depends on what is meant by Christian here, but in principle,
they work with the government, with the churches closely, so it's not. Of course, the church and state is separated, but they are friendly and work with each other. And of course, the government stresses Christian roots, Christian culture, makes in certain cases makes case for Christian ethics. For example, in the Constitution, they stated out that marriage is between a man and a woman, and something like this fundamental stuff.
Yeah. So
there is no theocracy at all. Of course.
No, I understand that. But every political party has its ideology, its philosophy, and it seems to me that if a political party that achieves government owns certain traditional Christian views, that's fine, so long as the party is answerable to the electorate, and any party that enters government does need to understand, and especially a Christian one, actually. The duties of charity require it. You know, when you enter government as a party that espouses certain traditional Christian views, you rule for the whole people, and one needs to be sensitive to that. But of course, whatever party is in government pursues certain policies, and not everyone in the electorate will like it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter whether you're Christian or non-Christian or liberal or communist or just conservative.
They are active.
That's a fact of political life.
Yeah.
But I see no problem in principle with a party espousing traditional Christian views on family, for example.
And what is the one of the big questions here is corruption, if it's big or not, or corruption is particularly an anti-Christian sin or not. And many people who are, especially here at Budapest, where there is a distinct conservative Christian cycles, who are small cycles but opposing the government, they say that because they perceive the government as corrupt, let's say, more corrupt than it should. Its Christianity is, let's say, fake Christianity.
I see.
So my question is, if there is a clear line between legitimately Christian politics with the fallen human nature.
Right.
Given that corruption is just a sin between others, maybe bigger than someone's, but
yes.
Or there are cases when you can say that it's fake Christian policy, or maybe it could be asked for the individual also. So
yeah. So first of all, the crucial question is, what do you mean by corruption? The fundamental corruption of any government is that government rules only for some, but not for the whole people, or that those in power use their power for private purposes, not public ones. So that's the worst kind of corruption. Some people might say, well, the government is too close to certain interests or non-governmental powers or people or foundations or whatever. I mean, that's one needs to look at the case there, because, of course, the left is upset when a government is too closely aligned with certain interests, but the left is very happy when it's in government. It has its own interests. So there's in terms of the accusation of corruption, this is a political context, and one has to look at the case. As for as I've said earlier, even if a government is, as it were, ideologically Christian in certain respects, I still don't expect it to be perfect, and nor would I be shocked if certain members of the government were corrupt. I would hope if the government were deeply Christian, that it would repudiate corruption and sanction those who were corrupt. But again, I don't expect perfection.
And my last two questions here are, one of them is that as I heard the news, the Anglicanism is both a kind of wokeism into.
So again,
the Anglicanism in the last conference, it's integrated some aspects of woke ideology. As I saw Justin Welby to speak about that, or so what and also Anglicanism is it seemed to be a little bit disintegrating, let's say, today. So what are your thoughts about the state of the Anglican Church regarding that? You are rather more old-fashioned Anglican theologian.
Yes, okay. So just to explain, in England we have an established church. It's the Church of England. It's Anglican, which is basically Protestant. And I'm a priest in the church. I'm a Anglican theologian. So yes, on the one hand, the church, like all mainstream churches in Britain and I think in Western Europe and to a lesser extent in the United States, membership is declining. So that's a problem. Although the church remains established, and I support its establishment, so that is why a few weeks ago we had the coronation of our king. And if you watch that, it's a deeply Christian ritual. Really traditional. And I think it's symbolically very healthy. One reason I support our monarchy is that when the king is crowned, the king is on his knees and receives the symbol of authority from above, from the church. And I think it's good for a state to recognize the state is not divine, it is subject to a higher authority, and I think that's great. But yes, I myself disagree with a number of positions that my own church has taken with regard to immigration and with regard to race. Fortunately, in the Church of England, I can disagree, and I've published criticisms of my own bishops. But to some extent, what you're seeing in the church is the same in society. You have the educated elite, the bishops and the clergy, who lean to the left. The body of lay people in the church lean to the centre right. So there's a kind of elite people division there that you see in the population at large, and you know, analyses of Brexit have discussed that. The elite were shocked by Brexit, but it revealed a division between the university-educated media classes, people leading institutions, and the same applies to the church. And I think the church needs to pay attention to that.
Is there a way to renovate the Anglican Church?
Oh yes, yes. I mean, I know the Archbishop of Canterbury. I like him personally. He's been very kind to me. But we need to talk more than we are, and we also, I think, need to think harder before we speak. As for attracting more people into church, I mean that is, I mean, the church has been wrestling with that problem for the whole of my life, not very successfully, but I'm confident the church will survive.
So, me too. And you said that you don't agree on immigration with the church.
That's right.
What is the last time? You know, some weeks ago, the Pope Francis were here at Budapest, and the old debate again rose up that if you are Christian, you can be against mass immigration or something like this. Which I have my own position, but I'm curious about your one. That
yes. So
what a Christian could say on that.
Well, I do think it's important that states be able to control their borders. Simply because as even a centre-left expert on these things in England, Paul Collier is a development economist. He wrote a book called Exodus 6-7 years ago about immigration. He made the point that control of immigration is important because when a very large number of people come from Syria to Germany or England all at the same time, naturally they congregate together, they create a ghetto, they don't integrate, and that causes social problems.
Parallel societies.
What's more, it also means something like a third of all Syrians with university degrees now live in Europe, which is not good for Syria. So it is a problem, and control is important. So the bishops of my own church have come out very strongly against the present Conservative government's proposal that anyone crossing the English Channel from France in boats illegally will be refused any chance of residing in Britain. They'll be sent to Rwanda in Africa, processed there. If they have a claim for asylum, they can make a new life in Rwanda, or else they get returned to where they came from. The bishops have opposed this as being immoral. I disagree. First of all, because the migrants coming across the channel are not coming from a war zone, they're coming from France, which is safe. And secondly, as far as I understand it, Rwanda is sufficiently safe. So we're not returning them to a war zone, we're returning them to somewhere that's safe. And the point of this is to undermine the business model of the human traffickers, because once it's clear anyone crossing the channel is not going to be permitted to enter, then the whole economic rationale for trafficking people collapses. That's the point. And it seems to me that although the means of achieving the end of discouraging illegal trafficking are severe, sending people to Rwanda, it's not cruel. It's disappointing. But it seems to be what's necessary to solve the problem. But my bishops disagree.
And the guys there did know, even when they started, that it's illegal.
So you can cross the channel, but you won't. If you're found, you will not be allowed to reside in Britain ever. But let's be clear. I mean, Britain at the moment is I think in the last 12 months. We have admitted 600,000 immigrants.
Very
I mean, mostly for reason they're there for economic reasons, but we've received several hundred thousand Ukrainians and people from Hong Kong and others. So this is not about refusing immigrants, it's about controlling immigration.
So there is no such a human right that you could move on your own anywhere where you want, and that the political community should accept everyone without reservations.
Under international law, there is no such right, but nor is it morally just that you should. No, no. And we're not in that situation just now. But if you look back in history, I mean, the Magyars arrived in this part of Europe. They were mass immigrants and they displaced peoples. Good for the Magyars, not so good for those they displaced. And the mass migration of peoples is a...
Although not really anybody were here.
Was no one here? Well, okay, that was fortunate. But, but there are other cases.
There were some people here. So
I mean, in my own country, in England, after the Romans left in 410, Angles and Saxons came to England, and it seems they obliterated much of Roman society. We're not in that position just yet, although unless countries in, let's say, Africa or the Middle East become more stable, Europe is going to be subject to increasing pressure from immigration. But the risk is, the worst case scenario is the migration is so overwhelming that societies are damaged or collapsed.
There will be nothing left why they came.
Well, in the worst case scenario, but of course, yes, and that's counterproductive because people want to come here because life is better here than there. But if they come here in too many numbers, then life becomes less better here.
Yeah.
So no one wins. But it's a major problem. But I just don't agree with my bishops that in England that diverting illegal migrants to Rwanda for processing is cruel and inhuman. It's not.
So my very last question is if you could summarize your Barthian Thomism for me, because
all right,
seemed to be a little bit contradiction.
Yes, my original work, my first book was on the ethics of Karl Barth, the famous Protestant theologian. But I've since described myself as a Barthian Thomist. So part of me is quite fond of Roman Catholic teaching. So what that's about is I am Barthian in the sense that I am Protestant in thinking that Christian thinking should be centrally shaped by a vision of the world that is shaped by the example of Jesus Christ. And so it is centrally Christian. On the other hand, I do believe in natural law. I believe that the world is structured by moral principles that are universal, and that there is, as it were, wisdom outside the Christian church that we need to take into account. So I want Christian thinking to be at once Christian theological, that's the Barthian bit, but also Thomist in the sense that it recognizes that the world is created by God, the world is created by God, and that God has shaped the whole world, not just the church, and that there are truths that people outside the church do perceive correctly. So both Barthian and Thomist. I think in terms of whereas Barth and the Protestant tradition is quite good at identifying, as it were, the Christian principles that govern a moral vision of things, an ethic. When it comes down to judging cases, not so good. The Catholic tradition, with its kind of scholastic method, its very systematic, careful, rational method is much better. So I'm Thomist in that respect too. I would say it's cold. Yeah, it is cold, but it's exact. Yeah, and it's careful. And Protestant thinking is not so careful. So I'm Thomist in that respect too.
Thank you very much for your contribution.
I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.